Hey guys, Argeiphontes here, and this is the second video in my Wild Hunt match commentary series. And this time I'm against Orphantears. We are both undefeated in the Swiss so far at 4-0, so there's a lot of bragging rights in the Swiss rounds on the line here. Orphantears brought a lineup with the Swap Ethlanist, as well as Alchemy and Greatswords. Meanwhile, I brought Soldiers, Greatswords, and Shoop. Orphantears opts to ban my Shoop list, actually, leaving me with Greatswords and Soldiers, because both his Aethne and Alchemy are sort of controlling lists, and his strategy is to target my Greatswords. Meanwhile, I just go ahead and ban his Greatswords list, because in my opinion, I actually think I'm favored against the Aethnist with my Greatswords list. And not only that, I also think that my Soldiers list is really, really strong against the Alchemy list. So, I just want to ban his strongest deck and hopefully run into the correct favorable matchups. As it turns out, he decides to start Aethne first, which is still a perfectly fine matchup for Soldiers. I was blue coin, so I went ahead and just played my Soldiers. Orphantears, knowing he needs to keep the Soldiers down, goes ahead and uses his archers. I will continue to just play out my Soldiers here, and he will continue to match that with his archers. So being able to keep my Soldiers down is very important here, because every soldier represents 2 extra points of buffing from the sentry when I eventually get to dropping the sentries. Because I am on blue coin, I am a little concerned about tempo, of course. The soldiers are only worth 9 points each, so I have to be careful I don't fall too far behind, otherwise I might have to go 2 cards down to win the round, or lose on even, neither of which I particularly want to do. Orphantears thinks about his play a little bit, and then he decides to just go for a standard thinning play, which makes a lot of sense. The Aethne decks generally have a whole bunch of thinning in them, and given that Orphantears hasn't drawn many golds, he wants to just thin aggressively to find his golds and silvers. So meanwhile, on my side of the board, I've played all of my slave infantry now. There are no more left in my deck, and I'm just thinking about how I want to proceed with this round. The next obvious play would just be to play the recruits, which I do, and this fetches out my sentry, which buffs all of my slave infantry. So this is a huge boost in tempo with 7 slave infantry on the board and the sentry. That's a 22-point play, plus the recruit, 23, even better than Siri Nova. This is the raw power of the Soldiers deck at work. Of course, Orphan brought the swap list, which runs a bunch of high power bronzes. So his Vrihid brigades are able to swap for massive amounts of points. And as you can see, he's able to almost keep up with my tempo. So over here, I'm actually thinking about potentially passing, because I am kind of still scared about losing a card potentially. But I decide that I think I can potentially threaten to even push a card out of Orphantears by spying right here, and that is what I do. I end up playing my Rainfarm to put the spy on Orphantears' side of the board. It's better to win round 1 than to lose it on even, so this is a really scary play because it basically says either you pass right here, or I'm threatening to just overtake you, and then I can win on even. Playing the spy basically reverses the coin flip. Orphantears, of course, also has a spy. I did the little time skip there because the video recording was a little weird, but Orphantears just opts to use his ADC, Ozer's Double Cross, to spy me back. This once again makes it safe for Orphantears to keep on playing, because now I won't be able to win on even since I'm back on blue coin. I decided to go for just a Vanimar here because I figured he had 6 units, might as well get max value out of it. However, this play actually turns on his Scorch, And in hindsight, I think this might have been a pretty big mistake. By turning on the Scorch, I give him a very powerful tool to stay in the round. Basically give him 15 points here. His next strongest play would have been the half-elf at 13. So I might have wanted to just save the Van Humor for a little later in the round, perhaps, and just play out other things, such as decoy on my recruits for another century. Of course, that all happened anyways, so right now I'm just figuring out whether I want to pass or potentially win this round. I decide to go for the Calvite just to see what I'll get. I ended up drawing my second century, which puts me a whopping 39 points ahead. So this is a massive point lead, and I'm looking to find the pass here, actually. Orphantears is in the tank for a bit, but eventually goes with Isengrim Outlaw as his play. He has 39 points to make up, 40 actually if he wants to win, so he needs to just go for super high tempo plays. And Isengrim Outlaw represents 21 points with the 14 point to reveal plus the 7 from the Isengrim himself. So here I also am in the tank for quite a while. I'm trying to figure out how many points he needs to actually win the round. And I believe with the 14 points off of Teruvial, bringing Orphantears to 64, Orphantears would need 19 points to win the round. So, with all that information in mind, I decide that the only way for Orphantears to win is to commit a really high value gold. In fact, I wasn't even sure he had one that could do it. So I just decide to pass right here. Now, as it turns out, Orphantears did have Eithne into Shrike in my own graveyard. And the Shrike that I played a couple turns earlier off of the Van Himar really comes back to bite me. And Orphantears is able to win one card up. So, on one hand, yeah, kind of sucks that I had to lose the round on 1 point. But I did get the Eithne out of Orphantears, so it's not the end of the world. Though definitely this was not the result I was hoping for. Looking back, I feel like the Van Humar play might have been a little too ambitious here, as it turned on the Eithne, and also it turned on the Scorch on Orphantears' side. But the game continues. Now, Orphantears opts to play into this round because the Soldiers deck is really scary in a long round 3, so he just wants to bleed me a couple more cards. I know this, and I definitely want to threaten to take the extra card for him. I'm in the tank for quite a while here, but I'm going to skip to the results, actually. I actually just decided to play Joachim. Looking back, I think this was probably a mistake. But my reasoning was at this point, I had a 50-50 chance to hit either Sentry or Novice in the deck, and Novice would have been a resurrection on one of my Slave Infantry. So I took a shot. I actually hit the Sentry, which was really, really awkward. It did keep me ahead that one turn, but now I ended up behind in points after the swap anyways. So, looking back, I probably would not have made the Joachim play. Instead, I probably would have done something safer, like resurrect his Vryhed unit from his graveyard. Vryhed Officer, I believe. And so now, seeing that Orphantears is continuing to play into the round, I unfortunately have no choice but to also drop my Novice. Orphantears looks at the board, looks at everything, figures he can afford to play one more card, which he does here. He opts to use the Mandrake, which makes a ton of sense because Mandrake's probably going to be pretty dead in round 3. The Soldiers deck doesn't do that much buffing, so it's nice to be able to get 16 points of value when you can. Seeing that I am actually down quite a large number of points, I actually decide to go for the Vikavaro Medic play on his Vryhed Officer finally, and swap out my own Asire. I figured this is one of the few ways I can actually keep up in points. So after quite a few moments in the tank, I decide to go for it. Unfortunately, this play does not catapult me ahead of Orphantears, mostly because the Joachim play kind of backfired. So I am stuck, I think, with a few points deficit after this swap play on my part. Yeah, just a 4-point deficit. Feels bad. If I just started with, say, Novice into the Slave Infantry, and then I pulled the Sentry out of my deck, I would have been able to actually catch up really rapidly in points. I would be 2 points ahead right now, and potentially force Orphantears down a card for round 3. But because I went for the super risky Joachim play, it didn't pan out, and I end up going into round 3 on even. So looking back, I think the Joachim play was definitely a bit too risky. It was a 50-50 to win the game on the spot, most likely, or to end up in an awkward situation like this. Whereas I had a couple more consistent plays I could have done that I think would have been good. Like if I just started with the Novice into the Slave Infantry, I think I still could do the Joachim play, but it would have just been a lot safer. Anyways, that is round 2, and round 3, if you were watching the stream when it was live, was a real heartbreaker. So Orphantears is playing Nova, which is a massive finisher, and I actually kind of like this a lot. A lot of Aithne control decks just lack points because they're too busy playing like triple Scorch or double Artifact Compression or all these control cards that at best trade even, unless your opponent lines up a Scorch or something, which most opponents, I think, at high levels will do their best not to. But Orphantears deck, with their Vryhead officers and, you know, the buffing from the Neophytes for carryover, and then finally the Nova finisher, actually generates quite a few points. And this becomes an extremely close game, as we'll see in the end. So I'm just checking my graveyard right now, trying to figure out a strategy with soldiers for round 3. All 3 of my sentries are in my graveyard, so if I want to resurrect any soldiers, I'm going to need to shuffle back my sentries. And indeed, I shuffle both of them back into my deck. This way, when I resurrect soldiers with my Triss, and then try to finish the game that way, I will have some sentries to buff those slave infantry. And indeed, I play my Triss because using Decoy on the Asire doesn't really do anything. I decide to go for the Ointment on the Novice. This fetches one of my Ointments from my deck. And using that, I resurrect a Slave Infantry. So my plan here next is to decoy my Novice and fetch another Ointment from my deck. Orphantears just goes ahead, of course, and plays his half-elf, which makes sense. He wants to save Nova for last. I'm thinking for a second just to make sure I'm not missing anything. I'm looking at my deck list. I'm looking at what's in my deck. And at this point, I realized that I still have Geralt Igni in my deck. I recall thinking in my head, man, it'd be really awkward if I fetch Geralt Igni with the Village of Forts. But I have to play on. I have to bounce my Novice, find my Recruit in my graveyard with the Ointment, and then fetch the Sentry, because I don't really have another choice. So Aithne here just goes for ADC for value, gets a 13-point play, which is pretty strong. And now I have 3 cards left in my deck, and a Village of Forts to burn my Recruit. So I believe my last 3 cards are Sentry, Gigni, and Ointment. I do the 1 in 3 shot, and I find the Igni. So, yeah. If I were able to find the Sentry or the Ointment, I would have been able to get my last Sentry on the field, which would have been enough to win. But instead, I find a 5-point play in the Igni. Feels really bad. Did not have last say or the card advantage from round 2, so Siri Nova was able to take the game. I definitely could have played either round 1 or round 2 a little better. I think either by forcing the win in round 1 and thus getting last say in round 3, or by sequencing round 2 a little better, playing less risky. But at this point I just had to shake it off and go into round 2, or rather game 2. And this is a game of Alchemy versus Soldiers. So Soldiers is very favored in this matchup, but Alchemy can kind of even it out a little bit with the likes of Vikovaral Medic to resurrect the Slave Infantry and Mardromes to shrink the Slave Infantry as well and banish them. So Orphantears, I believe, actually runs 2 medics and then also the Mardrome. So I still definitely need to be on my toes in this matchup. He opts to just start with Cantarella because he doesn't really have other proactive plays in his hand, and he's always able to hit the Cantarella with his Viper Witchers. Obviously, I can't really pass here because I don't want to just give Alchemy the round and then allow him to bleed. So I just decided to play the standard opening of Slave Infantry. Here I am, again, considering all my options. So you'll see this a lot where I'm just thinking, and then I just play the obvious play, like Slave Infantry. And that's because I'm just trying to make sure I'm not missing anything. 95% of the time, just playing the Slave Infantry is probably correct. But there's always that 5% where maybe another play would have actually made more sense in that situation. And it's better to spend a little extra time in the game, especially such a high-stakes game in a tournament setting, to figure that out instead of kicking yourself later because you missed out. So Orphantears is still in an awkward spot with his plays. This is why the matchup is so bad for Alchemy. There just isn't anything really big for the Viper Witchers to hit, so he's forced to play a 8-point Ale there. I go ahead and play the Recon, and I actually have basically most of my units in my hand, so the Recon was pretty favored to hit. I think I was at a 2/3 chance to hit the last Slave Infantry. I go ahead and just play my Sentry. He plays his Viper Witcher on the Sentry. This game goes pretty routine, I would say. I just play my stuff, he plays his stuff. And eventually I'm able to force him out of round 1. And indeed, the Sentry play right here does the job. That's a massive point gap, so Orphantears has no choice but to forfeit the round. So we go into round 2. Orphantears does have his graveyard active at this point. Both Kahir and Ointment are live, so he is set up for round 3. I think for a little bit here, figuring out if there's any reason whatsoever to bleed. However, as the Soldiers deck, I am kind of favored going into round 3, so I'm fine just dry passing here. And indeed, I do so right there. So Orphantears just burns an Ointment to win the round. Puts 2 in his graveyard because I think he's afraid of... No, he just wants to thin a bit more, I think. The Ointments aren't amazing because, again, the Viper Witchers don't have great targets if I'm sequencing correctly. So he just wants to burn them and hopefully draw more impactful cards. And he draws the Medic right there, which is actually pretty strong. He has all 4 golds in hand, so this is actually going to end up being a very close round 3. Orphantears opts to start with the Medic, denying me one of my Slave Infantry, which is a pretty powerful play. And I end up just answering in kind with my own Vicovaro Medic. I will be fetching his Novice after some deliberation. This just gives me an extra ointment in hand, which allows me to res a slave infantry of my own. Orphantears answers with a Sire here, which he uses to shuffle back my slave infantry and recruit, my 2 res targets from my graveyard. So that is pretty annoying for me. But thankfully my hand is actually crafted in such a way that I'm able to fetch them out of my deck again. And as you see here, I will be using Triss Telekinesis on Recon to do that just right now. And indeed I find the recruit, which finds me my last slave infantry. I only have 6 because Orphanteer stole one of them, but it is what it is. 6 is still a lot of slave infantry. It makes each sentry worth 20 points, which is still massive. So Orphantears just goes ahead and plays a Novice here into an Alchemy card. He's just kind of waiting and seeing what I'm doing. He's saving his gold cards to interact with my field once I have more stuff. So it just goes for the swallow there, which makes sense. I'm actually in the tank for a while, even though I skipped all of that for you guys. But I end up just playing my sentry here. I decide it's finally time. I'm just gonna get a massive point gap. Orphantears goes for the Calvite play. Doesn't really find anything too great, unfortunately, off the Calvites. Though, to be fair, all 4 of his golds were already in hand. So he takes a look at his field, his graveyard, everything, and decides to just ointment out a Viper Witcher to shoot my sentry, which makes sense. Sentry's 8 points. It's one of the higher point total plays on my side of the board that I'm likely to play this game. And indeed, if you notice, I'm holding a Sire in hand. Yes, I could have done something like shuffle back his Viper Witchers, but it's kind of awkward for him anyways, the Viper Witchers, so I might as well just hold a Sire and potentially use it to shuffle back my sentries and stuff, which is what I end up doing this game. So I go ahead and just play my Calvite here, just to see what's on top of my deck. I'm still missing a couple gold cards, so I find my Rainfarn and my Cantarella. Leaving Cantarella on top of my deck is probably not a good idea, so I'm just going to go ahead and play the Rainfarn into the Cantarella. And the Cantarella actually is able to find me Village of Forts here, which is really, really good. So I did shuffle Decoy to the bottom of my deck, but having access to Village of Forts is super strong. Orphantears goes for the Vesemir here after thinking for a bit, just because it's just a strong proactive play. He's saving the Mardrome and the Viper Witcher just in case he needs to interact with some of the stuff on my side of the field later in the game. And he just goes and burns the Black Blood here for a very healthy point boost. But I have yet to play 2 cards in hand to match his 4. So the point gap is actually way closer than it looks right now. I just go ahead and Asire back my 2 sentries, which this deck ends up doing a lot because that is just kind of how your finisher works in round 3. You need the sentries to win round 1 or round 2, but once it gets to round 3, you just have to reload and use them all over again. Otherwise, your deck is playing a bunch of 9-point Slave Drivers as your round 3 finisher, which is less than ideal. So, Orphantears finally finds a target for the last Viper Witcher, gets full value by shooting the Asire, but this is fine by me. I go ahead and just use my Strike here. There's really no harm to doing so. Arguably, I might have been able to drop like a Weather early or something like that, and I probably should have actually. I'm not sure why I saved it so far near the end of this game, but it's fine. With a Strike, it's still 16 points, and that's more than plenty in this matchup. So Orphantears is down to his last 3 plays. I actually have double last say because of the Cantarella, which is pretty nice. So I'm just kind of playing out the non-essential cards in my hand and then waiting until Orphantears passes to make my final most impactful plays. Orphantears goes for the recon, finds the medic, and just medics the sentry because he actually has 3 slave infantry on his side of the field. So that's actually a pretty high point value play. That's 15 points off of the recon, which is not bad at all. I am currently down 40 points, but again, I'm 2 cards up in hand. I just go for the Village of Forts here, looking for either Ointment or a Sentry. I find the Ointment, which finds the Sentry, and immediately puts me within 11 points of Orphantears. Orphantears counters with his own Village of Forts. Is able to only find an ale, unfortunately. And at this point, it's just a matter of playing out the cards left in the hand. Even though it looks like Orphantears has quite the sizable gap, my last 2 plays after this, Novice is just massive. So Novice just ales, which is fine. Orphantears' last play is a Marjoram, which doesn't really have a great target. He ends up just killing one of my slave infantry, which is pretty smart in case I fetch my last sentry. But as we will see, after this play, he's only up 24 points. And Geralt Igni is actually just enough to close the gap to a tie, which means Joachim fetching any of the units left in my deck is enough to win the rounds. And indeed, I just go ahead and slam the Joachim, actually just find the Golem, but that is more than okay. It is enough to win the game. So that is game 2. It was a favorite matchup for me, and I was on red coin, so the result is kind of expected, I would say. Which just leaves us with our last match. Finally, we have Great Swords versus Alchemy. So this is an unfavored matchup for Great Swords. Basically, Alchemy is able to shut down all the engines and then use Graveyard Hate to shut down the powerful round 3 finishers. So this is going to be very, very tough. My specific Great Swords list is a bit weird. I play Wild Boar of the Sea, but I also play Jenge. Usually when you play Wild Boar, you want to have a 10-point Greatsword to buff to 11, which puts it out of the range of the Viper Witchers, and then gives you a finisher for round 3. However, I realized a lot of Alchemy lists were running stuff like Vicovaro Medic, and of course they always run a Sire. So having one massive Greatsword actually, I realized, was a bit of a liability. So my strategy in this matchup is actually just to buff my ships with the Wild Boar. I'm just trying to kind of bait the Orphantears into actually hitting my Greatswords as just random targets for the Viper Witchers, and I'm actually going to try to rely on my ships to win the game for me. So as you see here, I started with Pirate Captain, and then I dropped the Wild Boar on my ship, putting it outside of Viper Witcher range, and also making it so that I get some carryover on the ships. Orphantears doing classic Alchemy things, making my life a little bit miserable with the Golem, and then also just drinking a lot of beer. So I go ahead and just play a second ship here, actually. I briefly considered playing the Greatsword, but I kind of just wanted some points on the board that were ticking. Orphantears established that he likely wasn't going to shoot my ships because he didn't shoot the first one. So it's fairly safe, I think, just to play the second ship here. And this helps you maintain tempo. So a lot of the problem with the Greatswords and Alchemy matchup is usually you play a Greatsword, they shoot the Greatsword, you play a Greatsword, they shoot the Greatsword, you play a third Greatsword, they shoot the Greatsword, and suddenly they're just 15 points up because their Viper Witchers are +5 every time they hit your Greatsword. So I actually like to start ship in the matchup, and if they shoot the ship, then I play the Greatsword, because they can't shut down all 3 greatswords that way because they invested a Viper Witcher on a ship. And likewise, if they don't shoot the ships are ticking for points. So even if I don't grow a single greatsword in the game, at least I have the ships going for me, so I don't lose tempo round 1. I played out all my ships, so finally it's time to play my greatsword. Looking back at this game, I think I actually perhaps positioned my greatsword incorrectly. I might have wanted to position the greatsword next to the first ship instead of the second ship, so the wild boar can still buff the second ship 1 more tick. But it is what it is. That is what I chose to do, so I need to live with my decision. He actually goes ahead and blocks my wild boar tick with his Cantarella, which is a pretty smart thing for him to do. I place my greatsword here next to the ship. He shoots it with a Viper Witcher, but my other greatsword was finally able to tick up, so that was kind of nice. I think for a bit here, and then I wait until I start roping, as is tradition, only to just play my last greatsword next to the ship. Orphantears goes ahead and shoots my 11-point greatsword. That's the bigger of the 2, so it is the most threatening. And I'm out of greatswords and ships to play. This is kind of one of the drawbacks of the Jenge version of this deck. It's just I can't fetch my 3rd ship with my Croc, unfortunately, because of Jenge. So I'm stuck in this slightly awkward position where I just have to play the Herald here. Looking back, I think I played the Herald 1 turn too early, actually. I probably should have went ahead and Coraled, because Coral is probably not going to find a better target than a 16-point Novice anyways in this game. So realizing that, here, with the Herald, I'm threatening to do the Jenge off of my Croc, but I actually opt to just go for the Coral instead, because I should have done that anyways. So that's a little bit of a misplay on my part. So I'm actually puzzling through this right now myself. I'm thinking if I play the Jenge, I set up for a massive Jenge in my graveyard at 16 points, which I can res with Sigdrifa, but Orphantears plays a Sire, because it's Alchemy. And a Sire can shuffle the Jenge back into my deck, which is very bad for me in a round 3 situation. So ultimately, I end up holding off on playing the Jenge. Instead, I just go for the Coral. And Orphantears thinks for a little bit here, decides, you know what, you can have the round. You have 3 ships ticking, so it's going to be hard to keep up, and also the Herald. So he just goes ahead and passes after considering his options. So I end up winning round 1 down a card, which is not ideal, but Orphantears was able to flip the coin flip with his spy, and I was not able to find my own spy. So going into round 2, I actually think the dry pass is correct here, because I don't really have a super developed graveyard with a bunch of super strong greatswords, so I don't feel favored in the short round against Alchemy's finisher. However, I realized that I had Restore in hand, and I wasn't positive if Orphantears had a Sire or not. So I was really afraid of the Restore getting bricked by a Sire, and I decided to play out the Restore and then just Corsair into my biggest ship here to hopefully maintain the tempo. I'm not sure if this is correct. Maybe because the matchup is kind of unfavored anyways, I just have to take a risk here and hope he doesn't have the Sire. In fact, I probably should have done that. I think I might have had a chance in round 3 if I did. Spoiler, I do lose this game. Orphantears takes the opportunity to just Mardrum my ship. The Mardrum in a shorter round 3 isn't going to get as much value, so he uses it here. And here I'm thinking, do I want to continue pushing here? I'm really risking losing a card potentially if I do so. I ended up opting to just pass after thinking for a while. I'm not convinced playing the Restore here was correct, even though a Sire could potentially brick it. I feel like maybe I should have just taken the risk, because I really need all the advantages I can get against Alchemy, and having 1 less turn to tick my ships when I don't have anything big in my graveyard anyways to kind of use as a finisher might make the difference in this game. So I do just pass here, of course. because I also realized I don't want to continue playing this round. Orphantears just shoots the ship, nice and easy, wins the round. So we go into round 3. At this point, my biggest greatsword is 11, so that is no longer my win condition. And indeed, if you look at my hand, I don't even have a single priestess. Udrik shows up really late to the party, and I mean, I just mulligan it immediately. Orphantears on the play decides to just res a novice because he had a swallow left in his deck. Fortunately for him, he did have a proactive play. I just go ahead and use my restored pirate captain, just get out the combo. It doesn't really matter. I'm just trying to get out my ships as early as possible so they get maximum value from the ticks. Orphantears has a massive Calvite play, which does find a sire, which I did play around. So he's not able to find great targets to shuffle here. And after thinking for a bit here, he decides to shuffle his own Roach and my Herald into the deck, which is pretty smart. He's afraid of me sacrificing out the Herald. However, I do have Heim in hand, which is able to fetch Herald from my deck, so it ended up not being the absolute worst. Here on my side of the board, I'm like, damn, he shuffled my Herald. Alright, well, I guess I just play more ships. And indeed, that is what I do. I just want to maximize the number of turns my ships are ticking. So I'm going to get all 3 ships out of my deck at this point. I don't even bother playing my Greatsword until the very end, because I know he has Viper Witchers, he has access to ointments, and of course, as you can see, he also has one in his hand. So I just play my ships out first. If he wants the Viper Witcher a ship, that actually potentially gives me an opportunity to drop a Greatsword and have it stick. But he wisely does not. So I shrug and just play my Sigdrifa on one of my remaining Greatswords, which Orphantears immediately slaps off with his Viper Witcher, to no one's surprise. And this is where I have a very tough decision. So I have Heim in my hand, and I have both Skjal, Udrik, and Herald after the shuffle in my deck. So I also have the option of creating with the Heim. At this point, I'm pretty certain that Orphantears has Vilgefortz as his last card in hand, because that's just what Alchemy does. So I was trying to do the math on if I should create a Golem, create the Imperial Golem, and brick the top of Orphantears' deck. I figured I needed more points than that to win though, and I just kind of had to hope he didn't have it. So I go for the Scale play. It's a 50-50. I was able to find the Herald, which is pretty sweet. Which, looking back actually, if I found Udrik and then the Udrik fetched Herald for me, I think I would have won this game, because Orphantears would not have been able to burn my skull. I didn't do the math though, so maybe I'm wrong there. However, he did have the Vilgefortz for my Herald Skull, so I fetch my Jenge as my last play, and lose in a very, very close round 3. As you can see, I'm actually only down by 5 points. That's a bit rough, but that's just kind of how the Alchemy matchup goes. Even though I kind of shored myself up against it quite strongly, I think I maybe needed to play a bit riskier, maybe not play that extra round in round 2 with the Restore, which gave him the Mardrum opportunity on my ship, and also I just have to hope he doesn't have it sometimes. So played a little bit too safe, had some minor sequencing issues in round 1, but all in all I think this was a very good match against Orphantears. I'm not too unhappy with how I played. All 3 games were very close, and Orphantears as well I think played very well and deserved his win. So that concludes this video. I will see everyone back probably in a week's time for the quarterfinals match.